Get ready, because we're diving deep today
Yeah.
into a figure. I think everybody kind of knows the name,
Yeah.
but we're going to look at Malcolm X in a whole new light.
Absolutely.
We're going beyond the sound bites, past those iconic photos, and really try to understand the man.
Yeah, it's a journey.
Yeah.
And it starts with understanding just how much his early life really impacted him. We're not talking about like a normal childhood.
No, not at all. So
Yeah.
paint that picture for us. What was his early life like?
All right, so imagine this.
Yeah.
His father was a Baptist minister, but he was also a huge supporter of Marcus Garvey,
What?
the leader of the UNIA advocating for Black empowerment, Pan-Africanism,
Right.
He really believed in Black self-determination, and that had a huge impact on Malcolm from a very early age.
So activism was already there in the household from the get-go.
Yeah.
But I imagine that comes with a price too, right?
Yeah, a heavy one, actually. Their family home was burned down by white supremacists when Malcolm was just a kid.
Oh my God.
And then in 1931, his father died under really suspicious circumstances. Officially, it was ruled an accident,
Okay.
but many people believe that he was murdered by white supremacists. So you can imagine the impact of that kind of loss and fear at such a young age.
It's unimaginable. And it's no wonder that idea of injustice became so central to his message later on.
Exactly. And if that wasn't enough, the trauma really devastated the whole family. His mother suffered a mental breakdown. She was institutionalized. The kids were split up, put in foster care. It just adds these layers of instability and loss to an already tragic situation.
Yeah, and I always think about that story from his school days. He's a bright kid, told his teacher he wanted to be a lawyer, and the teacher basically laughed at him, told him to be realistic.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a path for someone like you. Can you imagine how crushing that must have been?
It really speaks volumes about the systemic barriers that were already in place that sadly we're still dealing with today.
Right.
This was a pivotal moment for Malcolm. It was when he realized just how limited his options were simply because of his race.
It's something that's sadly relatable for a lot of people. I think that moment when your potential is just stifled by someone else's prejudice.
Right.
And in his case, it seems like this really fueled his turn toward a different path.
Yeah.
One that ultimately led him to the Nation of Islam.
And that's where things get really interesting. It's 1946, Malcolm's in prison for burglary, and that's where he first encounters the Nation of Islam.
Right, the NOI.
The NOI, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, this wasn't just about religion for Malcolm. This was a lifeline.
Right, because it was more than just a belief system.
Yeah.
It was community. It was structure, something that had been missing his entire life.
Exactly.
And their message of Black empowerment, self-reliance. It must have been incredibly powerful, especially at the height of segregation in America.
It resonated so deeply with him. The NOI provided this sense of belonging, this shared struggle, and this hope for the future that he was really lacking. And Malcolm dove right in. He used his time in prison to educate himself. He was devouring books on history, philosophy, religion, politics. This is where he honed his intellect and became the powerful speaker and thinker that we remember him as.
And this is also where he takes the name Malcolm X, right? Rejecting his slave name, as he called it.
Right.
Which is just such a powerful statement in itself. It's about reclaiming your identity, rejecting the labels that are forced upon you by a system that's designed to oppress.
It's about self-determination. That single act, that name change, resonated so deeply with people who felt marginalized, unseen, unheard. It was a symbol of defiance, and it was incredibly powerful.
And as Malcolm X, he becomes this magnetic leader within the NOI, attracting these huge crowds with his charisma and his increasingly sharp critiques of racial injustice. So what were some of the key ideas that he was focused on in this period?
He was really calling out the systemic nature of racism in America,
Right.
which at the time was revolutionary. It challenged this idea of integration as like the ultimate goal.
Right.
He argued that true liberation would require Black people to have economic and political control over their own communities.
But it wasn't just about equality on paper, it was about empowerment.
Absolutely. He wanted Black people to have the power to shape their own destiny, free from these constraints of a system that was designed to keep them down. And he wasn't afraid to speak truth to power, to call out hypocrisy wherever he saw it.
And his speeches from this era are electrifying.
Oh, yeah.
You can feel the urgency in them, the frustration at the slow pace of change. Like that famous line, "We declare our right on this earth to be a human being by any means necessary." It's a statement that's often taken out of context, I think.
Yeah.
But in that moment, you can feel the weight of centuries of oppression just behind those words.
It's a cry for justice, a cry for recognition for basic human rights that had been denied for far too long. And it really resonated with people, especially younger generations, who were starting to question the nonviolent approach of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it's interesting because Malcolm X is often seen as this radical,
Hmm.
almost antagonistic figure, especially in contrast to someone like Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
But the truth is a lot more nuanced.
Absolutely. In fact, towards the end of their lives, their paths actually start to converge a little bit.
Really?
Both Malcolm X and Dr. King started to recognize that true equality would require a complete overhaul of the system,
Wow.
like a fundamental change.
But before those ideas could really fully develop, Malcolm X goes through this incredible transformation.
Yeah.
He goes on this pilgrimage to Mecca,
That's right.
and it ends up reshaping his whole worldview. So tell us about that experience. What happened there?
So imagine this Malcolm who had built his message on the idea of inherent white evil, finds himself surrounded by Muslims of all races from all walks of life united in prayer.
Wow.
It was a profound experience that really challenged these deeply held beliefs he had about race and religion.
So it's this wake-up call, this moment of realizing that there's more to the world than the narrative that he had embraced.
Yeah, absolutely. He saw firsthand the universality of Islam, how it transcended race and nationality,
Yeah.
which was a far cry from the segregated world he knew back in America. This experience led him to embrace Sunni Islam, and he adopted the name El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz,
Okay.
which signified this really profound shift in his identity. He returned to America a changed man.
And which again speaks to this idea of constantly evolving, right? Like being open to new information,
Yeah.
changing your mind as you grow.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful lesson for all of us.
Right.
So what kind of impact did this shift have on his activism?
It was huge. He comes back from Mecca much more open to dialogue. He's even willing to work with white activists that he had previously criticized.
Wow.
He's starting to see the struggle for Black liberation as part of a larger global movement for human rights.
So he's connecting those dots between racial injustice in America and colonialism and oppression that's happening around the world,
Yeah.
which is incredibly forward-thinking to frame this as like a global human rights issue.
And this is where it gets even more fascinating because you start to see glimpses of what Malcolm X could have become, the leader he might have evolved into. He traveled to Africa, he met with leaders and activists, and he was seeking international pressure on the U.S. government to address these systemic violations of Black Americans' rights.
It's just a shame that we never got to see where that path would have led, because his life was cut tragically short. Assassinated at just 39 years old?
It's a devastating loss. It really makes you wonder how much more he could have accomplished if he had lived, how his ideas would continue to evolve, the alliances he might have forged. We lost a powerful voice for change that day.
And yet, even though he was assassinated relatively young, he still left behind this legacy that's incredibly complex and powerful. What do you see as his most enduring contribution?
I think it's his unwavering commitment to speaking truth to power, to challenging the status quo, even when it was uncomfortable. Like his autobiography, for example. It's a testament to that. It's this raw, honest look at his journey, his evolution.
And it's interesting, too, because he grapples with some really difficult questions in that book.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from his past, from the anger and the hate that fueled some of his earlier activism.
And that's what makes it so powerful. He doesn't try to sugarcoat things. He owns his mistakes. He acknowledges his shortcomings, and that's incredibly powerful. It reminds us that we're all on a journey, and it's okay to make mistakes, to change our minds, to grow.
And it's impossible to talk about Malcolm X's legacy without acknowledging his impact on the Black Power movement.
Absolutely. His ideas about self-defense, about Black control of Black communities, really resonated with activists who were frustrated with the slow pace of change. Groups like the Black Panther Party drew heavily on his teachings, particularly his emphasis on self-reliance and community empowerment.
But it's also important to note that his legacy extends far beyond just the Black Power movement.
Of course.
His work influenced education, the arts, anti-colonial movements all over the world. He was a global figure whose words resonated far beyond the borders of the U.S.
Yeah, you're right. His influence is still felt today in everything from hip-hop music and culture to contemporary discussions about race identity and social justice. And while there are definitely critiques of some of his earlier rhetoric, his willingness to evolve to challenge his own beliefs is a powerful testament to his character.
It's that complexity that makes him so fascinating. Even today, he doesn't fit neatly into any box.
Right, and that's a good thing.
It is.
It's a reminder that we should be wary of labels, reducing individuals to just sound bites or slogans.
Right.
Malcolm X was constantly evolving, and that's part of what made him so impactful.
So for our listener then, who wanted to understand Malcolm X at a deeper level, what would you say is the key takeaway here? What can we learn from his life, his journey?
I think the biggest takeaway is that growth is a process.
Okay.
His story reminds us that it's okay to change our minds, admit when we're wrong, embrace new ideas, new perspectives.
It's about being open to the journey, even if it takes you in some unexpected directions.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, even those that we might disagree with.
Yeah.
Malcolm X's life was full of contradictions,
Right.
moments of darkness and light.
Sure.
And I think that's what makes him so relatable.
Right.
He wasn't this perfect icon. He was a human being who was flawed and constantly striving to learn and to grow.
And that striving, that commitment to self-improvement,
Yeah,
it's something we can all learn from.
absolutely.
It's about recognizing that none of us have all the answers.
Right, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's about embracing the journey with all of its twists and turns. And it's about using your voice to speak out against injustice, to fight for what you believe in, even when it's difficult.
Because as Malcolm X himself said, the future belongs to those who prepare for it today.
That's right.
And understanding these nuances of history, the journeys of figures like Malcolm X, that's a huge part of preparing for that better future.
Absolutely. And I think there's no better way to understand him than to go straight to the source. Read his autobiography, listen to his speeches, grapple with his ideas. You might be surprised by what you discover.
I love that. That's great advice. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the extraordinary life and legacy of Malcolm X. We hope this has given you a new perspective on this very complex figure and inspired you to continue exploring his work. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep challenging your assumptions, and keep the conversation going.